Greetings, I am Herbert Erpaderp, and today I'm going to build this IBG Zrinyi, which I'm sure I'm not saying anything close to correctly. Anyway, it's a Hungarian 75mm assault gun, or as we ended up referring to it in stream chat, 75mm ass, owing to a sensible cropped image. This 70-second scale kit is the first one from IBG that I've ever built. I bought it because the subject isn't something I've ever built before either, and it looked pretty interesting. I'm fairly sure this is the first Hungarian vehicle that I've built as well. There's nothing on the back of the box, so let's just go and look at what's inside. There are 5 sprues moulded in grey plastic. Please insert the "there are 4 sprues" Star Trek reference here. 2 of these sprues are identical, the ones with all the wheels, tracks and suspension gear. I had no idea what to expect of this kit, but I have to say that I was pleasantly surprised. The plastic here is neatly moulded and quite crisp looking. There are mould lines of course, but they're really not too bad, and shouldn't take you too much time to clean up. These are some pretty fine pieces here, and I don't mean like, damn, that's a fine ass, even though this 75mm ass is pretty fine. What I mean is there are some very thin and fragile looking parts. They don't just look fragile, they are, so do be careful with them. The plastic does have a little bit of flex to it, which is fine and might actually prevent some breakage. When I bought this kit, I was expecting it to have rubber band tracks. It was a pleasant surprise to discover that they are link and length. Very nice. The detail, in my opinion, is pretty good. There's a lot of nice rivet detail around the vehicle and things like that. I'm no Hungarian 75mm ass expert, so I can't tell you what might or might not be missing from the vehicle, and of course some bits and pieces are bound to be omitted, because that's just what happens when models are made, particularly in smaller scales. What's there though is really nice looking. I especially like the upper hull part. All the hatches are already in place, so I guess we don't get the fun of gluing those in, but that's okay. They look nice. The rivets aren't too big, but they are still pretty obvious, as they should be. The kit also includes some instructions. Surprising, I know. It actually was kind of surprising that these are in colour. It's not super common for this sort of thing to be in colour, but it is nice when it happens. All of the actual instructions themselves are still in a grey colour, though I don't suppose there's any real need for colour here. It would be useful if there were different options being pointed out to us, but that's not something this kit has. It only builds the model in one way, not that that's a complaint of course. This page shows us some other kits available from IBG. These look pretty good and I'm definitely interested in a couple of them. The back page has a painting and marking guide, which is another thing that's nice to have in colour, though obviously this vehicle is pretty much a single colour, and the painting instructions are very basic. They can be useful as a starting point, so I can't complain too much. Decals. They are also included with this kit. There isn't a ton of markings here, but that's fine. There's enough to get the job done, and that's pretty much all you really need. Well, it's all I really need anyway. They look decent and neatly printed. I don't know how well they'll perform yet, but I'm sure they'll be fine. Enough waffling, let's build. Okay, I'm still going to waffle, but I'll also be building. We start with the suspension. The first thing to do is glue the wheels onto the suspension parts. You can probably see in the video that these arms that hold the wheels do flex a little bit. It's not really a problem, just don't be too rough. It would be very unfortunate to break them. You might have to do a little bit of nudging to get the wheels to sit nice and straight, but this is pretty simple to do. We end up with 4 sets of these 4-wheeled bogies. There's a lot more suspension to put together though. Next, we glue more wheels to suspension parts. It's just as simple as with the previous lot. As long as you're careful to get the wheels nice and straight, things should be fine. You can see that I've stabbed myself while filming this, like a moron. Oh well, the show must go on or something like that. We end up with 2 of these longer 8-wheeled suspension assemblies. I'm kind of glad the only assembly these needed was adding the wheels. Looks like it could have been pretty fiddly otherwise. To finish these big road wheel assemblies, I glue 2 of the 4-wheeled assemblies onto each of the larger 8-wheeled ones. There's keying for the rectangular part at the top of each bogie, and the wheels line up with each other. Nothing too challenging here. Those can then be set aside to bond while I work on the hull. This is a pretty straightforward assembly. There is keying for the side parts which helps get the sides onto the bottom nice and neatly. I apply a little bit of pressure to minimize some gaps. I then glue the upper part of the hull front into place. This does go in nicely, though I had to apply a little pressure to minimize gaps. I couldn't get my fingers in where I needed the pressure, so I used the back of my knife blade. I then gather up these wheels and turn them into return rollers. This is as easy as it looks, which is to say very. And the result is this small pile of return rollers. These return rollers can then be glued onto the sides of the hull where you might expect them to go, which, if you can't figure out, is the mounts onto which I'm gluing them. They go on easily enough, though there isn't really much of a pin there for them to mount to, so I did manage to knock a couple of them off. I would suggest handling this with care. Next, I put together the idler and drive sprockets. These are fairly simple, and there's keying to help put them together properly. I did have a couple of issues with these. First, I couldn't quite tell which back part of these should go with which outer sprocket part, and I got 2 of them wrong, which I guess isn't that bad, but it was still annoying. It was also a bit tricky to clean out the remnants of the sprue gates from between the teeth, and I did accidentally remove a couple of teeth from the sprockets. My thought was to try and hide these with the tracks if I could. The front and rear sprockets are different from each other. The rear one has a sort of raised nub in the centre of it, while the front one doesn't. Next, I glue the road wheel and suspension assemblies to the hull, which, you might guess, is pretty simple. There's a couple of raised nubs onto which these mount. A little pressure and they're on. I did add a bit of extra glue between the framey bits and the return rollers, just for a couple of extra bonding points. It probably won't add a lot of extra strength, but it'll do something, I assume. Also, at this point, you can see that I've added a roller that goes in front of the road wheel sets. I didn't film it though because of reasons. The main reason is incompetence. Then I add a sprocket. I'm not sure these front sprockets are drive sprockets, I think those are at the rear, where it looks like there's some kind of final drive casings. But then, I'm no expert. I don't add the rear sprockets at this point, with the hopes that it would make adding the tracks a bit easier, which is what I did next. This was my least favourite part of the build. In fact, I ended stream after getting one set of tracks on, and then did the other set off stream. I started with the large lower run of tracks, and then I added 2 sections to the front. It's not too fiddly to get these on, but I was a little bit dissatisfied with how angular the joins between the segments of track were. Didn't quite look right to me. Then come the individual track links. These were quite fiddly. Not surprising really. At this scale, the links are very small. It took a bunch of nudging and fiddling to get them on, but I did eventually get them on. The rest of the tracks go on pretty much the same way as the previous ones. There are individual links around the rear sprocket as well. I left the rear sprocket off until I was ready for it because I wanted to make sure the sprocket teeth would link into the appropriate holes on the tracks. As you can see, the result isn't perfect, but they're on. That's the main thing really, I guess. I didn't especially enjoy installing these tracks, though I have encountered worse. And I'm pretty sure it's still better than how rubber band tracks would have turned out. Rubber band style tracks would likely be a bit tight and cause damage to the suspension gear, which isn't the strongest. What matters is the lower hull is done, and it's time to install the side fender parts, if that's what you would call them. There's nothing too tricky about these, I just needed to apply a bit of pressure to try and minimize the gaps, particularly at the front where the gaps would be the most obvious. The good thing about these fenders is that they hide a lot of the tracks. The next step is to glue the upper hull part onto the lower hull. It's yet another easy thing to do. A little pressure was needed to ensure there isn't too much of a gap, and I'm pretty satisfied with the fit, though there is a very slight gap at the rear where the upper and lower parts meet. On the front, I glue the front of the casemate on. That makes sense. This part includes the mantlet and everything else you need to make the front of the casemate all in one handy dandy piece. Again, I applied pressure to minimize the gaps, which mostly worked, though there is a little bit of a gap along the top. That's probably fine, really. Next, I installed this muffler without videoing it. I'm pretty bad at this. Fortunately, there is another one on the other side which you can watch being installed later. I installed this hammer, or I think it's a hammer. It's pretty small. I needed tweezers to put this into place, and then my knife to nudge it into the final position. I follow that with this pickaxe. This is also very small and fiddly, and you'd probably break it if you happened to sneeze while holding it. I got it into place though, and it does look quite nice. Next comes a shovel with what appears to be 2 handles. I'm sure one of them is a bar of some sort, possibly one used by tankers for tanking purposes. Whatever you might call a bar like that. At the front of the hull I installed a fire extinguisher. You probably can't see the mounting holes for this, because they're so very tiny. It was a little bit fiddly to get into place, but not as much as I thought it would be. I follow that with a headlamp. This has a convenient round mounting on the fender, and it goes into place quite easily. You definitely want to put this on after the fire extinguisher. Having said that, it's probably quite obvious. There is a second one of these for the vehicle's right side. I doubt you need to see me installing that. Then comes a little stowage box. This is pretty easy to slide into the correct position. The box doesn't look like it would hold too much, so I kind of wonder what it's for. Maybe some sort of flat Hungarian food? What do Hungarians eat? Goulash? Are these goulash storage boxes? There's one for each side of the vehicle. Pretty simple. Next comes this tiny little antenna mount, or what I'm assuming is an antenna mount. I managed to get this into place with my fingers. I was pretty sure this part was going to end up flying away, so I was kind of surprised that I got it installed. I do like this part. It may be a bit fiddly, but it looks good. Another presumed antenna mount goes towards the rear. This one was also fiddly, even more fiddly than the previous one. I had to use my knife to nudge it into place, but it does go eventually. Now it's time to install that second exhaust muffler that you're all so excited about. This is fairly simple to get into place. There is a sort of keying on the rear of this part that links into the support bracket on the hull. Very exhausty. Moving on, I installed these jacks on the rear of the engine deck. There's mounting holes for the upper half of these, but the lower part just sort of sits there, so there's a fair bit of play here. Nothing a little bit of nudging can't take care of though. They probably don't need to be super straight, but I think I've got them on nice and neat anyway. Returning to the front of the vehicle, I installed some hooks. Unfortunately, the video is quite blurry here because I'm the worst. These were a bit fiddly, and I used my knife to nudge them into place. These hooks kind of curve inwards towards the sprockets. There's also a pair of these on the rear of the hull, and you can see them a lot clearer here. The only difference is the base of these parts is slightly angled to conform to the shape of the hull. Next, on the rear of the hull, I installed a spare wheel. This comes as 2 parts. Obviously you glue the inner one on first, and then the outer one. Though I guess you could glue the 2 wheel halves together first and then put that on the hull, if you wanted to do it that way. Next I installed this. I think it's something to do with smoke launching. It is yet another thing that I managed to not film myself installing. Good job, Herbert. After that comes another stowage box. This one is a bit more hefty than the ones on the front of the vehicle. I guess this might be for larger quantities of goulash? Or maybe something more practical, like tools or something. But if the British fill their stowage with tea, why not goulash for the Hungarians? There is a couple of bits of keying for this, so it's not too hard to put on. Next, I install some tools at the front. This set of wire cutters goes on the inside of the left fender. This is obviously a tight spot to get this part, so my knife substituted for my fat fingers. A bit fiddly, but nothing too outrageous. On the other side there's an axe. It's just about as easy to get into place as the wire cutters. And the final part, the main gun. It wouldn't be a 75mm ass without it. It wouldn't be a 75mm anything. I rather like how this part is moulded with an opening in the end of the barrel. This is usually much better looking than if I have to drill it out myself. Also, it's obviously less work. Less work for a better result? Who would say no? Probably some people who insist on doing everything the hard way, but I'm not one of them. The gun goes into place in the square hole here. The end of the barrel is shaped to fit with the rounded mantlet, so there's only really one way it should go. I nudge the gun around until it looks neat, and that's it. The Hungarian Zrinyi, or however you say it, 75mm assault gun by IBG is now completed. As I said at the start of the video, I wasn't sure what to expect of this kit. This was of course an impulse buy at the local hobby shop, and I'm pretty sure that I'd never heard of IBG prior to seeing this. I actually have to keep checking to make sure IBG is the correct order of the letters. This kit was pretty cheap, so I wasn't expecting too much. I was actually expecting it to come with rubber band tracks. I rarely let my expectations get too far out of hand, so I guess it's pretty normal for me that I wasn't expecting this to be the best thing in the world. That said, I was quite surprised by it. Sure, the tracks were a bit annoying, though to be fair, single track links are likely to be at least a little bit annoying no matter what company makes them, especially in smaller scales. It's not like all of the track links were single pieces anyway. There were plenty of long sections which were super easy to put on. And at any rate, they're much better than rubber band tracks. Some might disagree, and that's fair. I just really don't like rubber band tracks. I think this is a pretty interesting vehicle to look at. I really enjoy seeing and building something different. I think the detail on this is pretty good. I'm obviously no expert, but it looks pretty good to me. I rather like the rivet detail. It is visible, and fairly obvious, but it's not overly pronounced like you see on some models with riveted construction. I also like the suspension. It's probably going to be a bit of a pain in the ass to paint, but it looks cool. It's reminiscent of some earlier war tanks, though I do believe this was a reasonably late design, and I'm pretty sure it was only built as a prototype before the Soviets occupied Hungary. Anyway, I think the model looks really good, and it was a mostly enjoyable build. Once I got past the tracks, it was a joy, and it didn't take too long to do. Some of the tiny bits might prove to be tricky for some, myself included, but obviously they can be installed without too much issue. I mean, I did it, and so can you. There were some parts that I put on wrong, mostly the backs of the sprockets. The instructions weren't perfect around this, but it's also partly my fault. I could have paid a bit more attention to the parts. Oh well, it's built now and it looks fine. As with pretty much all of the models I've built lately, this one was built live on stream. If you want to watch me build models on stream and take part in the chat shenanigans, which for this kit mostly involved the words 75mm ass. Anyway, come and hang out with us. It's always a good time. There's a link to my Twitch channel in the description below. Give me a follow and you'll be notified when I go live. So, what do you think of this model? Have you built it before? How about some other kits from IBG? Let me know what you think in the comments section below. If you enjoyed this video and found it interesting or maybe even helpful, do share it with your friends or anybody else that might find it useful. Also, if you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe, follow, ring the bell, become a YouTube member or patron, and all of the other things you do on YouTube and social media. Links to all of my things are in the description below. And, as always, I shall return soon. So, until then, be excellent to each other, and thank you for watching. Farewell.